body is small and soft and almost entirely still, in the cold dark of deep water, suspended at a depth where no surface current reaches and no light falls from above. A creature the size of a human hand holds itself motionless through a barely perceptible movement of two small, ear-shaped fins. The fins pulse once, then again slower. The surrounding water absorbs the motion without a ripple, without a sound, and the animal drifts on, unchanged by its own passage through the dark. The mantle, the main body of the creature, rounded and gelatinous, yielding to the press of the surrounding water, catches no light because there is no light to catch. It is black in the way that deep-sea water is black, not as the absence of color, but as a quality of its own, a velvet depth of pigment that would read as pure darkness under any illumination that managed to reach it. The color is not a disguise. It is not a flash of camouflage deployed and released in rapid cycles. It simply is, held across the skin with the same permanence as the cold itself, fixed and quiet and absorbing. There is no surface glint off the mantle. There is no edge that catches the eye. The animal is here, hanging in cold water at depth, and it is dark in the way that the water is dark, and together the two darks form a single continuous thing. Two fins beat again, very slowly, at the upper curve of the mantle, where they sit like small rounded ears, symmetrical and soft. Each beat displaces almost nothing. The action is not propulsion, in the way most things move through water, not the torpedo urgency of a fish, not the muscular contraction of a hunting squid driving itself through open ocean. This is undulation, a slow, patient rhythm that produces just enough movement to hold the animal in position, adjusting its depth by fractions, keeping it suspended in mid-water with minimal expenditure of energy. The fins are the pace of this creature expressed as movement. They are unhurried the way geological time is unhurried. They do not suggest that anything faster is coming. Beneath the mantle, 8 arms spread outward and slightly downward, connected along their lengths by a webbed membrane that forms a continuous skirt of skin around the animal. The membrane is thin and dark, stretched between the arms like fabric pulled tight between spokes, and when the arms hang open and relaxed in still water, the whole structure takes on the geometry of a circle, a dark parasol, almost perfectly round at its edges, suspended open in the cold. There is no tension visible in the arms. They do not reach or grasp. They hold their position as the fins hold theirs, with just the minimal engagement of living tissue required to maintain form. The webbed cloak between them shifts slightly as the fins pulse, trembling at its circular edge, the way a thin cloth trembles in a very faint breath of air, and then goes still again. The motion is so small it might be a property of the water rather than the animal. Past the tips of the 8 arms, extending beyond the outer edge of the webbed cloak and out into the open water, trail 2 structures that are longer than the animal itself. They extend from the animal's body slowly, like threads drawn out from a spool, and they end somewhere in the dark that is too far from the mantle to be easily resolved as belonging to the same creature. These are not arms. They have no webbing, no suckers arranged in the patterns that define the arms. They are fine, elongated, and coated along their length in structures finer still, hair-like projections so small they are not individually visible from any distance, giving the filament surface a quality closer to texture than to structure. In the still water of the deep, they drift with the very slight current, oscillating just enough to register that they are attached to something living, receiving information from the dark water at their tips and carrying it back, slowly, toward the animal at their origin. This creature was named in the year 1903, more than a century ago, by a German marine biologist working through a collection of specimens taken during an ocean expedition that set out 4 years before that. The expedition had sailed into deep water and brought back things that no one had seen before, preserved in jars, strange and soft, and different from anything in the existing catalogs of the ocean's life. Among them was this animal, with its black mantle and its webbed arms and its red eyes, and the scientist who described it reached for a name that could hold the strangeness of what he was looking at. He assigned it a species name drawn from Latin, infernalis, meaning from hell, in response to its jet black color and the quality of its red eyes in preserved specimens. He was not wrong to reach for strong language. The animal is genuinely unlike anything else known to him, or to science at the time, or it would turn out to science since. The name of its genus, which the same scientist constructed, translates roughly as vampire squid of hell. The animal carries this name still. Vampirotuthis infernalis, suspended in cold dark water, its fins pulsing once and then again. The formal classification of the animal sits within a taxonomic order all its own, Vampiromorphida, a name that contains in its very uniqueness a biological fact of some weight. Most animals belong to orders that contain many species, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, the order being a level of classification broad enough to gather a whole community of related life. This order has one member, this one, the soft-bodied, dark-mantled, fin-driven creature hanging in deep water, is the single surviving species of a lineage that diverged long before the familiar shapes of the cephalopod class had fully resolved themselves into their modern forms. When the great separation of body plans was still underway, when the lineages that would eventually produce the octopus and the true squid had not yet fully diverged from each other into the distinct groups we know them as now, this lineage was already separate, already its own direction, already doing whatever it was doing in the deep water of its ancient ocean, while the future of cephalopod life was still unresolved and open. The octopus as it exists now is a creature of 8 arms, of no internal shell, of remarkable intelligence applied to the business of hunting and solving problems in shallow, well-lit water. The squid, as most people encounter the concept, is a fast, streamlined, jet-propelled predator with 10 limbs, 8 arms, and 2 elongated hunting tentacles, built for open ocean pursuit. Between these two groups lies a real biological distance, a divergence that separates them as clearly as body plan and lifestyle and nervous system can separate animals that are nevertheless related. That divergence is old. It happened long ago, and the animal drifting here in the deep water, with its 8 arms webbed into a cloak and its 2 trailing filaments that are not tentacles, its small gelatinous body, its slow fins, this animal separated from both of those lineages before they separated from each other. It is, in the language of evolutionary biology, a relict, a survivor of a line that is otherwise gone. The order Vampiromorphida once contained more species, or at least the evidence of related forms is there in the fossil record, and now contains only this one. Whatever the others were, they are finished. This one persists. The mantle, seen from the side, is soft in outline, not hard-edged, not rigid. Gelatinous is the word used for the tissue quality of the body, and it means what it suggests, yielding, water-dense, lacking the firm muscular architecture of a squid built for speed and pursuit. The body of a fast squid is organized around power. Rings of circular muscle in the mantle can contract violently, forcing water out through a siphon in a directed jet that drives the animal forward at speed. The body plan of such an animal is written in contraction and thrust. The body plan of this animal is written in something quieter. The mantle is soft. The tissue is not organized around explosive muscular output. It is organized instead around persistence, around being here in the dark at depth over long time with minimal mechanical demand on the living material that composes it. From the posterior end of the mantle, the rounded far end, away from the arms, the body tapers to a blunt point. The total length of the adult animal reaches approximately 11 inches from the tips of the arms to the end of the mantle, though the trailing filaments extend the functional length considerably beyond that, out into the surrounding water, where their endpoints vanish into the dark. 11 inches, the size of a hand from the heel of the palm to the tip of the longest finger. An animal that ancient and that singular, carrying a lineage older than the separation of its closest relatives, compressed into 11 inches of soft gelatinous tissue, moving through cold water on two small pulsing fins. The web between the arms, the umbrella as it is sometimes called, is a structure with no precise equivalent in the rest of the cephalopod class. In octopuses, the arms are connected at their bases by a short web, but the connection is modest, allowing the arms to move widely and independently as tools for exploration and capture. In this animal, the web extends much farther along the arms, joining them in a continuous membrane from their bases nearly to their tips, so that the 8 arms and the membrane between them form a single integrated structure, a cloak, a bell, a dark circle of skin that can open wide or draw its edges together around the animal's body, like a hood pulled closed. When the arms hang open and relaxed, the circular geometry of the web is most visible, the membrane taut and thin between the arms, the whole structure nearly symmetrical and wide. When the arms gather inward, the web closes around the mantle, enclosing the animal inside its own skin. This is not camouflage in the usual sense. It is not mimicry. It is a change in the animal's three-dimensional shape, from open parasol to closed sphere, that serves a different function, one that belongs to a later part of the animal's story. The chromatophores in the skin, the pigment-containing cells that give the mantle its color, produce a deep uniform darkness across the surface. Some individuals carry a warmer color, tending toward reddish-brown rather than true black, but the quality of the pigmentation across both variations is the same. It does not cycle, does not flash, does not shift from one hue to another in the rapid pattern changes used by cuttlefish and shallow water squid for camouflage or communication. The color of this animal is a single fixed state. It absorbs what light exists, and at the depths this animal inhabits, the light that exists is almost nothing, a faint and attenuated downwelling from the surface world far above, blue shifted and dim, penetrating from above in quantities so small they register more as a gradient than as illumination. Against this faint downwelling, a dark body produces a reduced silhouette. From below, looking up, an animal with a pale or neutral colored body shows as a shape against the faint sky glow of the surface far above. An animal that is dark shows less. The darkness of the mantle, persistent and passive, serves this function, not by any act the animal performs, but simply by being what it is. The eyes sit on either side of the head, large and forward-facing, their irises a deep red in living animals. In early preserved specimens, the chemical process of preservation altered their appearance in ways that read to human observers as unsettling. The staring discolored eyes of a preserved cephalopod in a jar of ethanol do not look the same as the living eyes of an animal at rest in dark water. But the red of the living iris is the color of the living tissue, and in the context of deep water, where the ambient light spectrum is dominated by blue-green wavelengths, the red of the eye is an absorber, not a reflector. It does not glow, does not give the animal away in the dark, does not produce the eyeshine that would mark it as a visible presence to anything capable of making its own light. The eyes are large. They are proportionally large in a way that will become significant when the light-gathering biology of this animal is considered. For now they are simply here, looking out into the dark water, still. There is no sound in this environment. This is worth holding for a moment, not as an absence to be mourned, but as a physical fact of the place. At depth, in mid-water, far from any current strong enough to carry turbulence, far from any surface where wave action disturbs the water into noise, the acoustic environment is close to total silence. Biological sounds exist in the deep ocean. The low calls of whales carry extraordinary distances through cold water, and the clicks of distant organisms, the faint crackling of biological activity in shallower or more productive zones. But at the core depth where this animal lives, the water is still and nearly silent. The animal's fins move through that silence. The webbed cloak shifts at its edges. Nothing makes noise. The darkness and the silence are the same kind of thing. Both are the absence of the surface world pressing down through hundreds of feet of water and losing itself on the way. What remains at depth is the cold and the pressure and the animal itself, persisting. The cold is approximately 39 degrees Fahrenheit. At the depths this animal favors, cold enough that every chemical process in living tissue runs slower, requiring less oxygen, burning less energy per unit time than the same tissue would at surface temperatures. This is not a coincidence. The cold is part of the set of conditions that makes this animal's existence arithmetically possible, in the way that a set of interlocking variables can be arranged so that they all resolve into a working equation. Cold water slows the metabolism. Slowed metabolism requires less oxygen. Less oxygen allows the animal to sustain itself in water that holds less of it. The animal lives where the oxygen is extremely low, and the cold that comes with that depth is part of what makes it survivable. The temperature of the water is part of the animal's biology, not just its surroundings, built into the speed at which its cells run, the rate at which its heart beats, the pace at which its fins must move to keep it fed and alive. The pressure at these depths presses on every surface, external and internal, equally, not crushing, because the animal's body is water-dense and largely incompressible, but present, a physical weight of depths that is simply the condition of existing here rather than somewhere else. An animal with gas-filled spaces in its body, a swim bladder filled with air, a lung holding breath, would have those spaces compressed by the pressure into fractions of their surface size. This animal has no gas-filled spaces to compress. The body is soft and water-dense throughout, the tissue yielding to the pressure the way the surrounding water yields to it, which is to say, it does not yield at all because it is already the same density as the water pressing on it. The pressure is not an obstacle to be overcome. It is a quality of the depth, and the depth is home. The two trailing filaments extend into the dark at lengths greater than the animal's mantle, their surfaces coated in the fine hair-like projections that give them their sensory and functional character. They are not tentacles in the sense that a squid's hunting tentacles are tentacles. Those are muscular, fast extending, equipped at their ends with a pad of suckers, designed to strike and grip a living animal before it can escape. These structures are finer, slower, and built for a different kind of contact with the surrounding environment. They trail, they extend into the water column. They are coated in materials that receive what drifts against them, accumulating information and substance from the passing water rather than reaching out to seize anything. In still water, they move fractionally with whatever slight current exists. In the total absence of current, they hang. Their presence beyond the tips of the arms adds a sensory reach to the animal that the arms alone cannot provide, an extension of the body out into the dark water around it, gathering what the dark water contains. The animal drifts on, very slowly, the fins making their measured pulses. There is no urgency in this. There is no urgency available at this depth, in this oxygen concentration, at this metabolic pace. The pace is the pace of what is possible here, and what is possible here is slow and quiet and continuous. The animal has been at this depth for the length of its adult life. The lineage that produced it has been here in the cold, dark mid-water of deep ocean for longer than either of the groups it predates taxonomically have existed as the things they now are. The separation between the true squid lineage and the octopus lineage is old, genuinely old, measured in the geological language of tens of millions of years. This animal's lineage was already separate before that divergence was complete. Whatever the ocean looked like when this line of life first established itself in deep mid-water, the ocean's surface looked very different from what it looks like now. The continents were arranged differently. The currents they shaped were different. The biological communities of the sunlit surface ocean were composed of organisms that have since been replaced by others. But in the cold, dark mid-water layer of the deep sea, the conditions that made this body plan viable, the cold, the darkness, the low oxygen, the slow rain of organic matter falling from above, those conditions persisted, and the animal that fitted itself to those conditions persisted with them. In the study of life on this planet, there are organisms that persist through geological time, not because they are actively competitive in a world of rapid change, but because they occupy a niche that does not change rapidly, a set of conditions so stable and so extreme that few things can enter it, and the things that can enter it and survive there are shaped so precisely by those conditions that the conditions themselves become a kind of protection. The deep, cold, oxygen-poor mid-water is one such place. It has been here as long as the ocean has stratified in roughly the way it stratifies now, and it will be here for as long as the ocean continues. The animal that found its way into this niche long ago has had no need to leave. The lineage has simply continued, in the dark at depth slowly, through time that is difficult to hold in the mind all at once, and so perhaps best simply felt as the accumulated weight of all those quiet generations, each one doing what this one does, drifting slowly on two small fins in the cold and the silence and the dark. The mantle color does not change. The fins pulse and pulse again. The webbed cloak at the arm tips hangs open in still water, its circular edge almost perfectly defined, the membrane thin enough that if any light reached it from any angle the water column could provide, the webbing would show the faintest translucency at its thinnest edge. No light reaches it. The edge is simply dark against dark, and the animal within it is the same dark as both. The two filaments trail into the surrounding water, their fine surface structures drifting and collecting and transmitting whatever information the deep water holds. This is the animal, a hand's length of soft, dark, water-dense tissue, a lineage older than the familiar forms of its nearest relatives, a body plan tuned over incomprehensible time to a set of conditions that the surface world knows nothing of. It is not dramatic in the way that a hunting squid is dramatic, all jet and pursuit and tentacle strike. It does not advertise itself. In the total absence of light and sound and urgency, it simply continues, the fins moving at their measured pace, the cloak open, the filaments extended, the blood running at slow circuit through gelatinous tissue under enormous pressure at near freezing temperatures, the whole animal organized around persistence rather than speed, around patience rather than force. The taxonomic fact of its singularity, that this is the only living member of its order, that it has no siblings in the tree of life, that every other branch of the lineage it belongs to is finished, does not register as loss in the way the loss of something familiar might. The animal is here, it is doing what it does, has always done, what the animals before it did, in the same cold water, at the same depth, over all that time. The fact of its solitude within its own order is simply a biological truth, one that sits alongside the animal's physical presence in the dark water, the way the pressure sits alongside it, not as a threat, but as a condition, and one the animal has been meeting without effort or awareness for longer than the forms of life closest to it have existed. One fin pulses, then both pulse together, a slow simultaneous beat. The webbed cloak trembles at its circular edge and goes still. The dark of the animal and the dark of the water continue, without boundary, in all directions. The lineage is old in a way that requires the mind to release the ordinary scale of time before it can be felt at all. 70 million years is old. 100 million years is older. The divergence of the cephalopods into their major living groups belongs to a time when the planet's geography, when a climate, its biological inventory at the surface, were all different from anything that exists now, different in ways so thoroughgoing that only the ocean's deep cold midwater has remained, through all that change, something like itself. And in that stable, extreme, unchanging place, this lineage did not need to change either. It persisted, it continues. Right now, in the cold dark of the deep ocean, more of these animals than can be counted are doing exactly what this one is doing, drifting, slowly, on small fins, in the silence and the cold, webbed cloak open, filaments trailing, the dark mantle absorbing whatever faint light falls from a surface world hundreds of feet above, a surface this animal will never approach, a world it has no use for. It is here instead, in the place it has always been, doing the thing it has always done, exactly that slowly, exactly that quietly, in the dark. The fins beat once more, the filaments drift, the animal continues, as it has always continued, through the still cold water of the deep, a soft and ancient and singular thing, held in the dark by just enough motion to stay exactly where it is, neither rising nor falling, neither hurrying nor resting, simply present, simply persisting in the enormous and unhurried dark. At around 200 meters below the surface of the sea, the last light goes out. It does not fade gradually, the way evening fades on land, moving through amber and rose before surrendering to dark. It goes in stages, the reds first absorbed within the first few meters, then the greens and yellows, then the deep blues pressing down through clear water until somewhere between 100 and 200 meters depth, depending on the clarity of the water above, there is simply nothing left. Not dimness, not a murk that the eyes might adjust to given time. Nothing, an absolute, physical absence of photons, unbroken from that depth downward for the full remaining miles to the seafloor below. It is here, precisely at this boundary, that the ocean changes in a second and more consequential way. The water at the surface carries dissolved oxygen, the way a cold drink carries carbonation, pulled in from the atmosphere above, stirred in by wind and wave action, produced in enormous quantities by the billions of tiny photosynthesizing organisms that live in the sunlit zone and breathe it outward as a byproduct of their work. Surface water in the open ocean holds between 5 and 8 milliliters of dissolved oxygen per liter. That number feels abstract. What it means, in practical terms, is that the water is alive with available gas. Fish breathe it freely. Crustaceans move through it without any constraint. Squid shoot through it with their jet propulsion systems firing, burning energy at rates that the cold dark below could never support. The surface ocean, for all its apparent simplicity, is a place of high energy and ready fuel. Below 200 meters, the fuel begins to disappear. The disappearance is not random and not recent. It is the product of a process as old as the ocean's current circulation patterns, a slow, patient, chemical transaction conducted across millions of square kilometers of midwater by organisms so small they are invisible to any unaided eye. When the photosynthesizing organisms in the surface layers die, their bodies sink. Everything that lives in the sunlit zone eventually dies in the sunlit zone, and what dies sinks, drifting downward through progressively darker water in a continuous, slow rain. Dead phytoplankton cells, the shed exoskeletons of tiny crustaceans, fecal pellets from zooplankton the size of a grain of rice, loose aggregates of mucus and bacterial cells, and fragments of things no longer recognizable as having once been individual organisms. It all sinks at different speeds toward the deep, and as it sinks, bacteria consume it. The bacterial communities that inhabit the midwater column are not large, they are not dramatic, they work entirely without light, without any organizing structure that a larger mind could observe and describe. They are simply present, in enormous numbers, in water that no sunlight reaches, and they are hungry, and what falls from above is their food. They consume the sinking organic matter through aerobic respiration, the same fundamental chemical process that runs in nearly every living cell that has ever existed. And aerobic respiration requires oxygen. The bacteria draw the dissolved oxygen from the surrounding water, molecule by molecule, converting it from a freely available resource into the carbon dioxide and energy of their own metabolism. And the ocean at this depth, unlike the surface, is stratified. The water layers do not mix easily. Fresh oxygen from the sunlit zone above does not descend to replace what the bacteria remove. The oxygen once consumed is simply gone. The result, across hundreds of meters of mid-water depth, is a layer of severe and sustained oxygen depletion. The dissolved oxygen concentration falls from the 5 to 8 milliliters per liter found at the surface toward values that most marine animals cannot survive. In the most extreme versions of this layer, dissolved oxygen drops below 1/10 of a milliliter per liter. In others, it hovers somewhere near 2/10 or 3/10, still far below anything that could support a fish pursuing prey, a squid firing its siphon, or a crustacean moving at the metabolic pace its body requires. This depleted layer has a name that describes it with precise accuracy. It is called the oxygen minimum zone. The oxygen minimum zones of the world ocean are not small features. They are not local anomalies or temporary disturbances. In the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean, the oxygen minimum zone extends horizontally across thousands of kilometers of open water, a three-dimensional volume of depleted midwater so large that it functions as an invisible ecological wall running through the ocean's interior. The northern Arabian Sea holds another. There are others distributed across the planet's ocean basins wherever the combination of high surface productivity and poor vertical mixing creates the conditions for bacterial oxygen drawdown to outpace replenishment. From above, the ocean's surface gives no sign of what lies beneath it. The water looks like water, but within the mid-water column, at depths between roughly 200 and 800 meters, there is a world most animals cannot enter, and most of those that do cannot survive. The descent into an oxygen minimum zone follows a gradient that can be measured but not seen. A probe lowered through the water column in the eastern Pacific would record the oxygen concentration falling steadily as it passed through the first 200 meters from the well-oxygenated surface layers through the progressively less productive twilight zone, where some light still penetrates and some photosynthesis still occurs. Below 200 meters, the probe would record the steeper drop. The numbers decrease. Not slowly, not gradually across many hundreds of meters, but in a relatively sharp transition that oceanographers can identify as a chemical boundary. On one side of that boundary, the ocean is breathable to most mid-water animals. On the other side, it is not. The transition happens within a span of depth that stood upright on land. A person could walk in under a minute. Inside the zone, the chemistry holds steady across an enormous vertical and horizontal extent. The oxygen does not recover with depth, the way temperature might level off or pressure might stabilize. It simply stays low, hovering near its minimum value, sustained there by the balance between bacterial consumption and the slow, inadequate arrival of oxygenated water from above or below. At the core depth of the zone, around 600 to 900 meters, in many parts of the eastern Pacific, dissolved oxygen concentrations hover near values that most cephalopods cannot survive long enough to find meaningful. Most fish species encountering this water turn back. The few that stay have paid for the right in the only currency evolution accepts, the slow, accumulated modification of biological systems across generations, so numerous they resist counting. At 600 meters, the physical conditions of the ocean bear describing one at a time because each one is a separate and compounding force on any living tissue. The temperature, first. At 600 meters in the eastern Pacific oxygen minimum zone, the water temperature holds near 4 degrees Celsius. To translate that into a felt fact, it is colder than the interior of most refrigerators. It is cold enough that nearly every biochemical reaction, every enzyme-catalyzed molecular transaction that constitutes the business of living, slows. Proteins change their shape slightly in the cold, and shape is everything in biochemistry. Membranes stiffen, diffusion rates drop. The speed at which a nerve impulse travels along a fiber, the rate at which a muscle fiber contracts, the pace at which a digestive enzyme breaks down a food particle, all of it slows, measurably and continuously, in water this cold. For most shallow water organisms, exposure to water at 4 degrees Celsius would constitute a crisis. Their bodies would begin to fail. For the organisms that live permanently at this depth, it is simply the condition of existence. Their enzymes are shaped for it. Their membranes are composed of molecules that remain fluid at temperatures that would stiffen a surface-dwelling animal's cell membranes into near rigidity. The cold is not an obstacle they overcome. It is the medium they were built for, in the same way that a surface squid was built for warm, well-lit, oxygen-rich water. Neither is tolerating a suboptimal environment. Each is living in the one it fits. The pressure, second. At 600 meters, the weight of the water column above exerts a force of approximately 60 atmospheres on everything within it, 60 times the pressure at the ocean's surface. 60 times the pressure a human body was built to sustain. This is not a force that can be felt in the way that cold can be felt, because the body of a deep-sea animal is not full of compressible gas spaces in the way a human body is. A human diver at depth must manage the nitrogen in their blood, the air in their lungs, the gas in their sinuses. A gelatinous animal like the vampire squid, whose body is mostly water, and water is for practical purposes incompressible, does not experience the pressure as crushing in the way a rigid-bodied animal might. The pressure is simply there, equal on all sides, present in the water that makes up most of its mass. The animal exists at 60 atmospheres, the way a human exists at 1, without noticing, because noticing requires a reference point the animal does not have. The darkness, third. At 600 meters, no sunlight arrives, not even the faintest blue remnant of the surface spectrum. The bioluminescence of other deep-sea animals, their slow flashes and steady glows, their brief chemical light, is the only photon source in the entire water column at this depth, and these are small, intermittent, scattered across an enormous volume of water. The darkness is not what a person lying in a darkened room experiences. In a darkened room, the eyes adjust, and the faint ambient light of electronics or street lamps through curtains registers as forms and edges. At 600 meters in the open ocean, there is no ambient light to adjust to. The visual system, given time, finds nothing. The darkness is complete in the way that only water and stone can produce. These three conditions, the cold, the pressure, the dark, together describe the physical world of the vampire squid's habitat. But they do not describe the one condition that makes its world singular among all the world's mid-water environments. That condition is the oxygen, or rather its near total absence. A dissolved oxygen concentration of 0.2 of a milliliter per liter, close to the lowest values recorded in the vampire squid's core habitat, is a number that requires some grounding to make real. The surface ocean, at 5 to 8 milliliters per liter, offers something like abundance. An animal breathing that water through gills moves through a solution where oxygen molecules are genuinely plentiful, where each breath of water drawn across gill surfaces delivers a meaningful yield. As the concentration drops toward 1 milliliter per liter, the yield per breath decreases. Animals that rely on rapid, energetic respiration, fish that pursue prey, squids that sprint in open water, begin to show signs of physiological stress below 2 milliliters per liter. Below 1 milliliter, most are in serious difficulty. Below half a milliliter, most cannot survive for long. The vampire squid has been recorded living and moving normally at concentrations of 0.2 of a milliliter per liter. This is not a marginal tolerance, sitting just inside the survival threshold. It is a profound physiological divergence from the rest of its class. Most cephalopods, the octopuses, the squid families, the nautiluses, share a basic respiratory framework tuned for water, with meaningful dissolved oxygen. At the concentrations where the vampire squid lives comfortably, those animals would be in crisis or already dead. The vampire squid has moved so far along the physiological spectrum that its survival range and the survival range of its nearest relatives barely overlap. They inhabit the same ocean, but a different version of it, one defined by the chemical conditions that exclude everything else. The marine snow that falls through the oxygen minimum zone falls through a world of enforced stillness. There are no large predators moving through the core of the OMZ in the way that fish patrol shallower midwater, not because the zone is hidden from them or unknown to them, but because the oxygen concentration will not support their metabolic requirements. a fish that could tolerate the transition zone at the upper edge of the OMZ, a zone where oxygen is low but not yet disqualifying, would still face increasing physiological cost for every meter it descended into the depleted core. At some depth, the cost exceeds what any amount of food at that depth could recover. The fish stops or turns back or dies. The OMZ core, as a result, is largely free of the active predation that characterizes every other marine environment at comparable depths. This is not a coincidental feature of the oxygen minimum zone. It is, in a meaningful sense, its defining ecological consequence. The depletion of oxygen has not simply removed a resource, it has removed an entire class of interaction. The zone is a place where the normal architecture of predator and prey, of pursuit and escape, of fast and slow, of hunter and hunted, does not operate. What remains is slower, more patient, calibrated to the long, quiet arithmetic of a world where energy is scarce and safety is the byproduct of chemical exclusion. A particle of marine snow entering the top of the oxygen minimum zone at 200 meters begins a descent that may take days. Depending on its size, density, and the vertical structure of the currents it passes through, a particle of marine snow falls at somewhere between 1 and several hundred meters per day. Some particles are small and loose and fall slowly, tumbling in slight currents, partly consumed by bacteria before they reach any significant depth. Others are denser, fecal pellets from large zooplankton, for instance, or tightly bound aggregates of many smaller particles, and fall faster, arriving at depth less degraded, still carrying significant organic content. All of them, regardless of their speed, pass through the same chemical gradient as they descend, from oxygen-rich to oxygen-poor, through the depleted core, and on toward the floor. For an animal living at depth within the zone, this continuous rain of organic particles from above is the connection between the sunlit surface and the permanent dark. The surface ocean produces organic matter in the light, through the photosynthesis of billions of single-celled plants, through the growth and reproduction and death of the zooplankton that graze on them. Some of that organic matter is consumed before it sinks. Some is recycled within the surface layer, but a fraction of it escapes, attaches to other particles, aggregates into drifting flakes, and begins the long fall. By the time it reaches 600 or 700 meters, it has been traveling for days. It has been partly consumed by bacteria. It has changed in composition, but it still carries calories, lipids, and proteins, and complex carbohydrates locked inside the remains of organisms that grew in the presence of sunlight and are now delivering that energy downward into the dark. The geographic reach of the major oxygen minimum zones ensures that this delivery is not a local phenomenon. In the eastern tropical Pacific, the OMZ spreads across an area measured in millions of square kilometers. Its vertical extent, from around 200 meters at its upper boundary to 800 or more meters at its lower edge, means that the volume of depleted water is not a layer in the oceanic sense, but a dimension. The mid-water column across a region larger than the continental United States is, at the depths where the OMZ is most intense, effectively sealed off from the high-energy world above by its own chemistry. The organisms that have evolved to live within it occupy a habitat that has existed in broadly similar form for millions of years. The OMZ is not a recent feature, but a persistent consequence of ocean stratification and surface productivity patterns that have characterized the major ocean basins for geological time. The vampire squid's lineage is old enough to have lived within something like this zone for most of its evolutionary history. The exact duration cannot be read from the fossil record with precision. Soft-bodied cephalopods do not preserve well, and the deep ocean is the least hospitable environment for fossilization that the planet offers. But the animal's fundamental biological organization, its taxonomic isolation, the degree to which its physiology diverges from all living relatives, all of these suggest a lineage that has been committed to this particular, chemically defined habitat for a very long time. Long enough that what began as an adaptation has become the animal itself. The low metabolic rate is not a response to the OMZ, it is the baseline. The highly efficient respiratory biochemistry is not a workaround, it is the design. There is a stillness to the oxygen minimum zone that is unlike the stillness of any other environment. The deep sea floor is also still, but it is still in the way that stone is still, cold and pressured and dense with settled sediment. The stillness there has weight and texture and a floor to rest against. The stillness of the mid-water oxygen minimum zone is different. It is a stillness of suspension. There is no floor in reach. There is no surface in sight or in chemical contact. There is only the water column extending hundreds of meters in every direction, carrying within it the slow drift of particles and the faint distributed activity of the bacterial communities that consume them. An animal at the center of this zone is surrounded by distance, distance downward, distance upward, distance in every lateral direction, all of it filled with the same cold, dark, oxygen-depleted water, all of it traversed at the pace that its chemistry permits. The conditions in the northern Arabian Sea OMZ differ in some details from those in the eastern Pacific. The depths, the precise oxygen concentrations, the thermal structure, but the basic character is the same. Where the ocean stratifies, where the surface is productive, and where vertical mixing is insufficient to replenish the oxygen that bacteria consume, the zone forms and persists. It is, in its way, a predictable consequence of the ocean doing what oceans do, cycling nutrients, stratifying with temperature and density, supporting enormous surface productivity, and allowing the byproducts of that productivity to sink. The OMZ is the shadow of the sunlit zone, cast downward through hundreds of meters of dark water. An animal that has evolved to live in that shadow has found something that most animals cannot touch, a habitat with almost no competitors and almost no predators, sustained by a food supply that arrives continuously from a world it will never visit. At 700 meters, where the water temperature holds near 4 degrees, and the pressure outside is equivalent to nearly 70 times the pressure at the surface, the vampire squid rests in the mid-water column in a condition of profound chemical exclusion. The dissolved oxygen in the surrounding water, perhaps 0.2 of a milliliter per liter, perhaps slightly more, is enough for this animal and no other of comparable size and complexity to sustain the slow burn of its existence. It is not thriving despite the conditions. It is not persisting heroically against a hostile environment. It is simply at home in the only way that biological systems can truly be at home, by having been shaped across more generations than any record can count by the precise pressures of the place they inhabit. The cold presses in from all directions, uniform and unrelenting, at the temperature of a deep refrigerator. The darkness is complete, the oxygen is nearly gone, and in the middle of all of this, turning neither toward the surface above nor the floor below, drifting in the suspended stillness of the mid-water column, the vampire squid rests. Its body makes almost no demand on the surrounding water. Its fins, when they move at all, move slowly. The cold is not something it endures. The dark is not something it waits through. The depleted water is not a limitation it works around. These are the terms of its existence, negotiated over evolutionary time so thoroughly that the negotiation itself is no longer visible, having become simply what the animal is. The OMZ surrounds it like water surrounds water, completely, evenly, without exception. Below the vampire squid, the sediment of the seafloor lies hundreds of meters farther down, accumulating the slow rain of particles from above, marine snow, the remains of organisms that passed through the same depleted midwater on their way to rest on the bottom, carrying within them the compressed chemical history of the surface ocean's biological activity. Above the vampire squid, the sunlit zone continues its noisy, energetic, oxygen rich business, indifferent to the cold and the dark and the chemical silence that begins 200 meters below it. The boundary between those two worlds, the precise depth where light fails and oxygen begins its long decline, is a real and measurable line drawn through the water column by physics and chemistry, as absolute in its effects as any wall of stone. On one side of that line, the ocean the animal cannot reach. On the other side, sitting perfectly within the depleted core, the vampire squid holds its place in the water column, and the water holds it back, and the exchange between them, the slow diffusion of oxygen across gill surfaces, the minimal metabolic demand, the patient existence in a space where almost nothing else can follow, continues in the dark, at depth, in the cold, as it is continued for longer than the current shape of the continents has existed. The zone does not offer comfort in any ordinary sense. It offers only exclusion, a chemical wall so effective at turning away competitors and predators that, for an animal built to live within it, the exclusion itself becomes a form of safety, and the safety becomes a form of peace, and the peace becomes simply the texture of an ordinary day. At 700 meters, in the dark, where the oxygen is nearly gone, and the water is very cold, and the only light that exists in the surrounding ocean comes from the bodies of the living things that have found their way here and learned to make their own. The vampire squid rests within this zone, not as an anomaly, but as a resolution, the product of a long biological equation, settled at last, in the cold and the dark and the thin oxygenated water, at a depth where the pressure is enough to remind any gas-filled space of its fragility, where the temperature slows everything toward stillness, where the depleted chemistry keeps away every animal whose metabolic needs exceed what the water can offer. Here, in the oxygen minimum zone, exactly here, with the sunlit surface more than half a mile above and the sea floor hundreds of meters below, the animal is precisely where its entire biology has been shaped to be. The water that surrounds it would physiologically exclude nearly every other macrofaunal animal of comparable size and complexity that exists in the ocean. That exclusion is not incidental. It is the arrangement. It is the quiet, unhurried, chemically precise arrangement that the ocean has maintained in this form for millions of years, and that the vampire squid has inhabited, in its lineage's way, for nearly as long. The cold holds the water still, the darkness holds the light out, and the depleted oxygen holds the rest of the ocean's animals at a distance, leaving this one animal in this one layer, completely and entirely and sufficiently alone. In the blood of the vampire squid, something is happening that no instrument placed from above could ever detect. The water surrounding the animal holds almost no dissolved oxygen, so little that the difference between the water and a complete vacuum, measured in the currency of breathable gas, is nearly nothing at all. And yet the hemocyanin moving through the animal's circulatory system is reaching out into that near-empty water and finding what it needs, molecule by molecule, binding oxygen atoms from a solution that should, by the physiology of almost any other creature, offer nothing worth taking. Hemocyanin is not red, where iron-based blood runs crimson through the vessels of fish and mammals. Copper-based hemocyanin runs blue-green, the color of the deep ocean itself, as if the animal's blood were made from the same substance as its home. Each molecule of hemocyanin carries copper atoms at its core, and it is those copper atoms that grip the oxygen, holding it briefly before releasing it to the tissues that need it. The vampire squid's hemocyanin grips oxygen at partial pressures, so low that the hemocyanin of shallow water cephalopods would remain largely empty at the same concentration, passing over the same water without being able to make use of it at all. In chemistry, the property is called a low P50 value, which means the molecule reaches near full saturation at oxygen levels that leave other blood proteins functionally starved. Set the name aside. What it describes is this: a continuous, quiet, molecular level concentration of oxygen extracted from water that offers almost none, happening inside the body of an animal, small enough to fit within a human hand, happening without pause, happening in the dark, several hundred meters below the last trace of sunlight. This is not a survival response. The hemocyanin of the vampire squid did not shift its properties when the oxygen became scarce. The animal did not hold its breath, or strain, or compensate. Its blood is simply built this way, calibrated over enormous spans of evolutionary time to function in water that would induce physiological crisis in nearly any other macrofaunal animal alive. The scarcity outside is the normal condition. The blood inside treats it as an ordinary resource. The gills that move the oxygen from the surrounding water into that blood are proportionally large. For a body of the vampire squid size, the gill surface area is generous, expanded beyond what the gills of shallow water cephalopods of equivalent size would occupy, will spread wide enough to maximize the contact between the gill epithelium and the oxygen-depleted water pressing against it from outside. The physics of diffusion are simple. Oxygen moves from where it is concentrated to where it is less so, and the greater the surface across which that movement can occur, the more oxygen crosses per unit of time. In well-oxygenated water, a modest gill surface area is sufficient. That in water carrying a small fraction of normal dissolved gas, the gill must do more with each exchange, and the vampire squid's gill is shaped by that long necessity, wide, patient, pressed against water it cannot afford to waste. The gill surface holds still against the cold. At this depth, the water temperature sits near 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to slow the diffusion of gases slightly, cold enough that every biochemical reaction within the animal itself runs at a reduced pace. This is not a problem the vampire squid is solving. The cold is not an obstacle. It is part of the same arrangement that makes the OMZ habitable at all. Reduced temperature means reduced metabolic demand, which means the amount of oxygen the animal needs per minute is itself lower, which means the sparse oxygen the gills can extract is enough. Everything compounds. The cold slows the animal down, and the animal is already calibrated to be slow, and the slowness reduces the oxygen demand, and the gill surface extracts enough oxygen to meet the reduced demand, and the hemocyanin binds it at concentrations that would leave other animals gasping. Each piece supports the others. Remove any one of them, and the arithmetic fails. The gill presses against cold water in the dark. The hemocyanin circulates. The oxygen crosses, and the vampire squid continues. Metabolic rate is not something the eye can see, but its consequences are visible in the way the animal moves through the water. In most squids, the fast, muscular, pelagic species that school in sunlit water and hunt in coordinated bursts, jet propulsion is the primary mode of locomotion. Water fills the mantle cavity. The mantle contracts sharply. A high-pressure jet expels through the siphon, and the animal accelerates forward. The whole cycle takes fractions of a second, and it burns energy in quantities that can only be sustained in oxygen-rich water, where food is abundant and available. In the vampire squid, this machinery exists in a reduced and altered form. The siphon is present, but the mantle does not contract in rapid, powerful pulses. The animal does not hunt with bursts of speed. The energy cost of jet propulsion, the sudden compression of water, the muscular work of each powerful stroke, is a cost this animal does not pay. What the vampire squid uses instead are its two ear-like fins, positioned near the top of the mantle, undulating with a rhythm that is almost difficult to perceive as motion at all. Each beat of the fins displaces a small amount of water. The displacement is enough to provide lift, to maintain position in the water column, to make gradual, unhurried progress through an otherwise featureless mid-water volume. The fins do not flap in the way a bird's wings do, urgently, repeatedly, with the body falling between each stroke. They undulate. The movement travels through the fin membrane in a continuous wave, one edge rising while another falls, so that the motion is never interrupted, never accumulating a moment of lost lift. It is a remarkably efficient mechanical arrangement, and it costs far less per unit of distance traveled than any propulsive system built around sudden compression and release. The vampire squid's resting oxygen consumption, the baseline metabolic rate of an animal simply existing in cold, dark water without actively doing anything, sits approximately 10 to 30 times lower per unit of body mass than the resting metabolic rates of shallow water squids of comparable size. This is not a number that means much by itself. Sit with it instead as a ratio of quietness. Where a shallow water squid burns 30 units of metabolic currency per minute simply to stay alive, the vampire squid burns approximately 1. The rest of the shallow water squid's expenditure goes to maintaining the readiness to burst, to keeping muscle tissue primed, to running a nervous system calibrated for speed and response, and the constant possibility of predation or pursuit. The vampire squid has none of these overheads. Its nervous system still works, its muscles still function, but the idle cost, the power the engine draws while sitting still, is reduced to something the OMZ can actually supply. At this metabolic rate, the animal can remain essentially motionless for extended periods without cost. Not motionless in the sense of holding a difficult pose, motionless in the sense that the water around it simply stops registering the animal's presence at all. The fins still, the arms hang within the webbed cloak of skin that connects them, forming a gentle rounded shape that catches no current. The animal holds its depth without adjustment. This is not sleep, not torpor, not any state of reduced consciousness. It is simply the baseline condition of a body calibrated to spend as little energy as possible while awake and aware in a food-sparse, oxygen-limited column of cold water. The heart that drives all of this moves slowly. There is no record of the exact resting heart rate of a living vampire squid in its natural habitat. The depth makes direct measurement impractical, but what is known from related physiology and from the animal's documented metabolic rate is that the cardiac pace is unhurried. Each beat circulates the hemocyanin-rich blood through the gills, picks up what oxygen the gill surface has extracted, and carries it to the muscles and organs that require it. The circuit is complete. The beat comes again, slowly, in the cold, at the pressures found in the vampire squid's core habitat. 60 to 90 times the atmospheric pressure at the ocean surface. The water itself becomes a structural medium. It presses evenly from all sides, not compressing the animal's tissues, which are mostly water and incompressible, but making any gas-filled space within a body a biological liability. True squids use gas-filled chambers for buoyancy control in some species, and some cephalopods maintain gas-filled statocysts for orientation. The vampire squid avoids this problem partly through its gelatinous body composition, which contains no significant gas spaces and requires no buoyancy compensation from internal chambers. It is neutrally buoyant not by carrying a gas-filled float, but by having a body whose density is so close to the surrounding seawater that the column of cold water holds it without effort, the way a very dense solution of salt water holds an egg suspended between the surface and the floor. In the midwater darkness of the oxygen minimum zone, the absence of the ink sac is worth noticing. Every other cephalopod studied carries one. The ink sac is a standard issue defensive organ, melanin-based, dark, released in a cloud that confuses a predator while the animal jets to safety. The vampire squid has none. The structure is absent entirely, an evolutionary loss that makes sense only in the context of everything else. To release an ink cloud requires water clear enough for darkness to be meaningful, requires a predator present, and requires the energy and oxygen available to jet away, while the ink buys time. In the OMZ, the water is already dark. The number of predators capable of surviving at these depths is small, and the oxygen cost of jet propulsion is too high to include in the budget. The ink sac was not maintained. What replaced it is a different order of defense entirely. From the tips of its arms, when threatened, the vampire squid can eject a cloud of sticky bioluminescent mucus, a substance containing thousands of glowing particles that can persist in the water column for several minutes after the animal has quietly withdrawn on slow fin strokes. Where ink conceals by darkness, this mucus conceals by misdirection. A predator turns toward the glowing cloud, investigates something that is no longer an animal, and by the time the investigation is complete, the vampire squid is gone. The substitution is elegant in the way that most deep-sea solutions are, not engineered, not designed, but arrived at through the simple logic of what works in a place where almost nothing does. The mucus cloud expands slowly in the dark water. Its particles drift apart on whatever faint current moves through the OMZ at depth. Each particle glows for minutes, an independent source of blue-white light suspended in a volume of ocean where no sunlight has penetrated in months. The animal that produced the cloud is already absent, moving on its slow fins, drawing no attention, returning to the stillness that is its ordinary condition. The cost of producing that mucus, compared to the cost of jet propulsion, is small. The vampire squid's energy budget is tight enough that the distinction matters. Every structure the animal maintains, every process it runs, every substance it produces, has to be affordable on the oxygen and food the OMZ provides. The ink sac was cut from the budget. The bioluminescent mucus was kept, or rather, the lineage that could produce it survived, and the ones that could not survive in the OMZ did not. This is the nature of the low-energy lifestyle that defines this animal, not just slowness, not just stillness, but a comprehensive reorganization of the body's priorities, such that everything expensive has either been eliminated, reduced, or replaced with something cheaper that performs the same function well enough. The muscles that would drive jet propulsion are not heavily maintained. The nervous system does not run at the pitch of readiness that an ambush predator's nervous system requires. The ink sac is gone. The hunting tentacles that true squids use for prey capture are absent. The metabolic overhead associated with rapid growth, with frequent reproduction, with the physiological demands of a fast life, are all substantially reduced. What remains is a body that costs almost nothing to run, extracts oxygen from water that offers almost none, feeds on what the water column delivers without active pursuit, and defends itself with light rather than darkness and patience rather than speed. It is not a simplified animal. The systems it maintains are precise and intricate. The hemocyanin chemistry, the gill architecture, the fin locomotion, the bioluminescent mucus production, but the systems it has eliminated or reduced were the expensive ones, the ones calibrated to a life of abundance and speed, and the OMZ offered neither. The ocean outside the animal is cold. The cold holds steady. In the dark, there is no sensation of the pressure, no subjective experience of being compressed from all sides, because the water presses equally in every direction, and the body, being nearly the same density as the water, barely registers the force. The pressure at 700 meters is roughly 70 times what it would be at the surface, but the vampire squid was not made for the surface. Its enzymes, the protein catalysts that drive every chemical reaction in its body, are shaped to fold and function correctly at this pressure, and bring the animal to the surface, and those same enzymes, in reduced pressure, would begin to behave differently. The animal belongs to this depth, the way other creatures belong to sea level, and the belonging is written into the chemistry of every cell. For a few minutes, imagine the heart beating slowly in the dark. It does not speed up for threats. The animal's first response to a predator is not acceleration, but display. The deployment of the bioluminescent cloud, the quiet withdrawal. It does not speed up when the filaments return laden with marine snow, because the feeding process is itself slow, and the quantity of food arriving is modest, and there is no urgency in the transaction. The heart simply beats, in the cold, in the dark, at a rate calibrated to the quiet minimum that keeps the circulation moving and the tissues supplied. The surrounding water is not silent in any absolute sense. At depth, low-frequency sounds travel vast distances through the ocean. The distant sounds of shipping, the calls of whales in warmer water above, the structural creaking of the ocean floor in places where the crust moves. None of these sounds are produced by anything nearby. In the immediate volume surrounding the vampire squid, there is no movement, no other large organism generating pressure waves at close range, nothing that would register to the staticists as a nearby threat or a nearby opportunity. The animal rests in the stillness of an environment so inhospitable to most life that it has the mid-water column largely to itself. This is a real kind of wealth in the ecological sense. The OMZ is not resource-rich. The marine snow that falls through it is nutritionally dilute. The oxygen it contains is barely enough to sustain the animals adapted to it. But it is also nearly empty of competitors and nearly empty of predators capable of thriving there. The vampire squid's low-energy lifestyle is not just a solution to oxygen scarcity. It is also the key that opens a territory almost entirely uncontested. To live here at all is to live without the pressures that govern life everywhere else in the ocean. No fast predator can sustain pursuit in water with so little oxygen. No competitor can maintain the metabolic overhead of an active lifestyle on so little dissolved gas. The OMZ is not a refuge the vampire squid chose. It is a place the vampire squid became capable of inhabiting, and in doing so found itself alone. The gills continue their patient work. Against cold water, Against near-empty chemistry, the enlarged gill surfaces press, and the oxygen crosses, and the hemocyanin accepts each oxygen atom with a molecular grip calibrated over millions of years of pressure and low oxygen and cold. The blood circulates, the heart beats, the fins undulate in their slow, continuous wave. It is worth sitting with the image of the gill surface itself for a moment, the gill epithelium in contact with the surrounding water. The epithelium is a thin biological membrane, and across it, oxygen diffuses according to the simple logic of concentration gradients, from higher to lower, passively, without any energy expenditure on the animal's part. The gill does not pull oxygen in. It simply presents a large surface area of membrane to the water, and the oxygen, following the gradient established by the hemocyanin, binding it on the inside, crosses over. The larger the surface, the more total crossing can occur in a given time. The vampire squid's proportionally enlarged gill surface maximizes this passive exchange in the most energy-efficient way possible, not by working harder, but by offering more area. This is a principle that runs through the vampire squid's entire biology. More area, less work. More contact, less active transport. More patience, less expenditure. The gill is larger so that diffusion, which is free, can do what active pumping would otherwise require. The fins undulate continuously rather than pulsing powerfully, so that locomotion can be maintained without the energetic spikes that burst swimming creates. The filaments extend into the water column passively, so that food collection can proceed without the cost of pursuit. The bioluminescent mucus disperses the threat of a predator without requiring the energy of a powerful jet escape. Again and again, the same solution. Find the passive route, offer more surface or more time, and let the physics do the work. In the management of energy, the careful allocation of oxygen and calories to functions ranked by necessity, the vampire squid has arrived at something that works in a place designed to exclude life. The ranking is simple. First, keep the heart beating and the blood moving. Second, keep the gills extracting. Third, maintain the nervous system at its lowest functional threshold. Fourth, move slowly enough to stay at depth. Fifth, and last, gather food. Everything else has been reduced or removed. The nervous system deserves a sentence. It is present and functional. The animal can react to stimuli, can modulate its bioluminescent displays, can retract its filaments, can orient itself in featureless dark water through the work of its statocysts. But it is not running at the speed of a predatory squid's nervous system, which must track moving targets, calculate intercept trajectories, time tentacle strikes to fractions of a second. The vampire squid's nervous system runs quieter than that. It monitors, it responds, but it does not maintain the perpetual high alert state that active predation requires, and the energy saving this represents is real. The cold helps here too. Chemical and electrical processes in nervous tissue are slowed by low temperature. The vampire squid's nervous system functions at 4 degrees Celsius, which means its intrinsic speed is already reduced from what the same tissue would achieve in warmer water. This is not a disadvantage in the OMZ. There is nothing moving fast enough nearby to require rapid response. The animal's threats and opportunities both operate on slow timescales, and the nervous system calibrated to 4 degrees is perfectly adequate for them. Outside the animal, the water holds its temperature and its chemistry with the stability of something that has been the same for a very long time. Oxygen minimum zones are not recent formations. They have existed in the deep mid-water of productive ocean basins for geological spans of time long enough for an entire lineage of cephalopods to have entered the zone, adapted to it, and become what the vampire squid now is. The OMZ did not change to accommodate the animal. The animal changed across incomprehensible lengths of time to fit the OMZ precisely. The fit is close enough now that the two are difficult to imagine apart. The chemistry of the zone determines the upper limit of what life can spend on oxygen-requiring processes. The vampire squid's physiology operates at a level below that limit. The cold of the zone reduces metabolic demand. The vampire squid's metabolism is calibrated to the cold. The darkness of the zone eliminates the possibility of visual predation by large, visually hunting predators. The vampire squid's primary defense is adapted for the dark. The detrital rain through the zone provides a continuous, if dilute, source of food. The vampire squid's metabolic rate is low enough to sustain itself on that dilute source. Every property of the zone is met by a corresponding property of the animal. The correspondence did not happen at once, and it did not happen by plan. It accumulated, one small change surviving better than the alternatives, across spans of time long enough that the zone itself may have shifted its boundaries several times before the fitting was complete. The animal rests in the middle of all this accumulated correspondence. The fins pulse, barely, continuously, the wave traveling through the membrane and returning, the heart beats, the hemocyanin circulates, picks up oxygen, delivers it, returns, the gill surface holds against the cold water. The nervous system monitors the surrounding darkness for information worth responding to, and the vampire squid exists in the only place it is fully equipped to exist, the place its entire biology has been shaped to inhabit, the place that would exclude it as surely as it excludes almost everything else if any single part of the arrangement were different. There is a stillness in the OMZ that is different in character from ordinary stillness. The stillness of a room at night has air moving through it, the distant sounds of the world continuing, the small thermal currents of a heated building. The stillness of surface ocean at midnight has waves, wind-driven pressure, the movement of plankton and fish in the water column. The stillness of the OMZ mid-water, at depth, in water holding almost no oxygen, where almost nothing large is alive. That stillness is something else. The water is cold, and it moves in slow, broad currents driven by the distant circulation of the ocean as a whole, not by wind or wave. There are particles of marine snow drifting down through the darkness, slowly, each one following the same slow trajectory, through the same cold water. There is the vampire squid, and there is the sound of nothing nearby, which is to say the sound of water, which is to say a low, omnidirectional pressure that has no identifiable source and registers in the statistics as baseline, the known constant vibration of an ocean that is always moving somewhere far away. The vampire squid's body is at rest within this stillness. The metabolic rate that feels, by the standards of other squids, like near death, is here the normal, sustainable condition of an animal awake and operational. The hemocyanin is doing its molecular work. The gills are doing their surface area work. The fins are doing their quiet locomotion. And the animal's awareness, whatever the vampire squid experiences as awareness, is oriented into the surrounding darkness, receiving through its large eyes the faint bioluminescent signals of distant organisms, through its statistics the slow pressure waves of the water column, through its filaments the tactile record of what the water is carrying past. None of this is effortful. The effort was spent across evolutionary time in the long process of arriving at a body that does not have to strain to live here. The individual animal floating in the OMZ is the beneficiary of that effort, inheriting a physiology so precisely fitted to this place that inhabiting it feels, if felt is the right word for a cephalopod's experience of its own existence, like rest. The heart beats again, in the cold, in the dark, at its slow and sufficient rhythm. The gills hold their surface against the near empty water and extract what is there. The hemocyanin accepts each oxygen atom and carries it on its circuit through the body. The fins undulate in their continuous, unhurried wave. The water outside remains cold and dark and nearly still, and the vampire squid remains in it, not struggling, not compensating, not enduring, simply present, alive, calibrated, and entirely at home in a volume of ocean that has no room for anything that cannot meet it exactly where it is. The stillness inside and the stillness outside press against each other without tension. The animal's body temperature matches the water temperature. The animal's metabolic rate matches the oxygen the water provides. The animal's sensory systems match the quality and type of information available in the dark. The animal's feeding behavior matches the food the water column delivers. And the animal's defensive behavior, the glowing cloud of mucus, the slow withdrawal, the patience, matches the nature of the threats it encounters at depth. All of this fitting, all of this correspondence settles around the small, soft, gelatinous body of an animal drifting in cold and dark water several hundred meters below the last trace of light. The heart beats. It has beaten in this lineage for spans of time that make the history of human civilization appear as a brief and recent flicker. It will beat again, the gills will extract, the hemocyanin will bind, the fins will undulate, the water will hold its cold, its chemistry, its darkness, and the vampire squid will remain, suspended in the middle of all of it, belonging to it completely, its slow heart, the only warm pulse in a long column of cold ocean that is exactly, precisely, quietly enough. High in the water column, far above the cold and the dark, something is always dying. It happens at every moment of every day, across every sunlit stretch of ocean on the planet. Phytoplankton, cells no wider than a human hair, built of light and salt and dissolved carbon, reach the end of their brief lives and begin to fall. Zooplankton graze and digest and produce small pellets of compressed organic matter that sink almost immediately. Crustaceans molt and leave behind the ghost shapes of their former shells, transparent and weightless, drifting downward. Jellyfish and salps and larvaceans die and come apart as they descend, their bodies loosening cell by cell into the water column, and all of it, the cells, the pellets, the shed skins, the fragments, gathers into loose and delicate aggregates, bound together by threads of mucus and static charge, and falls. This falling takes time. A single particle may spend days or weeks descending through the water column, carried sideways by currents, broken apart and reaggregated, colonized by bacteria that feed on it as it sinks. The particle that left the surface as a fragment of intact phytoplankton arrives at depth transformed, darker, softer, its original structure largely consumed, its remaining substance a compressed mixture of bacterial biomass, lipid-rich remnants, and the molecular residue of biological activity that occurred hundreds of meters above. It is called marine snow, and in the deep ocean, it is a kind of rain. It falls through the oxygen minimum zone without pause. It falls through the cold and the pressure and the dark. It passes through a layer of water where almost no animal capable of consuming it can live. And on the far side of that layer, resting motionless in the cold, is the one cephalopod on Earth that has made this slow precipitation the entire basis of its existence. The vampire squid does not pursue its food. It does not chase, strike, or subdue. It does not calculate the trajectory of a swimming crustacean or time the extension of a tentacle against the movement of a fish. These behaviors, which define the feeding ecology of nearly every other cephalopod alive, belong entirely to a different way of life built on speed and pursuit, and the energetic expenditure that both require. The vampire squid has none of that. What it has instead is patience and two extraordinary structures designed to take advantage of it. From the base of its arms, where the webbed cloak of skin narrows back toward the body, two long filaments extend into the surrounding water. These are not arms. They are not tentacles in the sense that a true squid possesses them. They are structures without a direct equivalent in any other living cephalopod, retractile, slender, coated along their length in fine hair-like projections, and a continuous film of sticky mucus. In their fully extended state, each filament reaches beyond the length of the animal itself, trailing outward into the water column like a thread paid out slowly into a still and lightless room, and in this position, drifting with whatever faint current exists at depth, they wait. A particle of marine snow, descending through 600 meters of dark water, drifts into contact with the surface of an extended filament. The fine projections along the filament's length catch it. The sticky mucus holds it. The particle adheres and remains, and the filament continues to drift, and more particles arrive, one by one, at intervals that have no rhythm and no predictability, simply the slow statistical result of many things falling through the same column of water. Over time, the filament accumulates a thin coating of collected particles. The process has no urgency in it. There is no moment of capture, no expenditure of speed. The filament simply waits in the water, and the water delivers what it carries, and what it carries slowly gathers along the filament's surface in the dark. When enough material has accumulated, the filament is retracted. The motion is gradual and almost imperceptibly slow, not a snap or a pull, but a drawing inward, the filament folding back toward the animal's arms over the course of what appears, in remotely operated vehicle footage, to be a long and unhurried interval. As the filament retracts, the accumulated material is scraped against the arm surfaces and gathered into a small mass bound together by the animal's own mucus secretions. This mass, a compressed aggregate of bacterial cells, lipid fragments, shed exoskeletons, and the transformed remnants of surface ocean biological production, is then drawn toward the mouth and ingested. The whole sequence, from extension to retraction to ingestion, is conducted at a pace that matches the metabolism behind it, low, steady, and sufficient. The food itself, examined closely, carries a record of the surface world compressed into something almost unrecognizable. A single aggregate arriving at depth might contain fragments of a diatom that photosynthesized in sunlit water 3 weeks earlier, bacterial colonies that colonized the sinking particles somewhere in the midwater, the compressed residue of a copod's digestive process from a week before that, and intact lipid droplets derived from phytoplankton cells that bloomed briefly in surface waters and died before the particle even began to fall. Marine snow is not one thing. It is a layered archive of biological activity accumulated across weeks and hundreds of meters of descent, arriving at depth as a dense and nutritionally complex parcel, not rich in the way a living prey animal is rich, but rich enough for an animal whose requirements are calibrated so precisely to what the deep ocean can provide. The calibration matters. An animal with a high metabolic rate cannot afford to eat marine snow. The energy delivered per particle is too low, the particles too sparse, the collection too passive to fuel the continuous muscular and biochemical activity that a fast metabolism demands. This is the constraint that makes detritivory impossible for most cephalopods, not a lack of marine snow, which falls everywhere and always, but the mismatch between what the food can provide and what the consumer requires. The vampire squid resolves this mismatch not by improving the food, but by reducing the requirement. Its metabolic rate, the baseline rate at which its tissues consume energy to sustain themselves, sits far below that of squids of comparable size, living in oxygenated, food-rich water. Its muscles are calibrated to slow movement. Its organs maintain their functions at low power. Even its nervous system, which in other cephalopods supports the rapid processing required for active predation, operates in a register tuned to an animal that does not need to track, pursue, or strike. In this way, the feeding ecology and the metabolic rate are not separate adaptations. They are the same adaptation expressed at two different levels, behavior and biochemistry, together forming a single coherent response to an environment defined by scarcity. The vampire squid does not hunt because hunting is too expensive. It does not move quickly because speed burns energy faster than marine snow can replace it. And because it does not move quickly or hunt, it can subsist on marine snow, which is the only abundant food source in the oxygen minimum zone's cold and lightless interior. The logic is circular in the most elegant biological sense. Each constraint is also the solution to another constraint, and the whole system holds together under conditions that would dismantle any other architecture. It is worth pausing in the image of the filament extended into still water, because there is something in it that runs against almost everything cephalopods are known for. Squids, the other squids, the ones that move through oxygenated water in the dark above or in the light near the surface, are among the most actively predatory invertebrates in the ocean. They pursue fish at speed. They strike with elongated hunting tentacles, whose clubs bear suckers and hooks that seize prey in fractions of a second. They use jet propulsion to accelerate and maneuver with a precision that allows them to intercept moving targets in 3 dimensions. The entire cephalopod body plan, in its classical form, is built around this, built around the moment of capture, the rapid expenditure of energy in the service of acquiring more energy, the predatory logic that has defined the class for hundreds of millions of years. The vampire squid carries the body plan of a cephalopod, and none of that logic. It has 8 arms and a mantle and a beak and a radula, all the structural markers of the class, but the 2 elongated hunting tentacles that are the functional signature of true squids are simply absent. They were not lost in any sudden or catastrophic way. The vampire squid's lineage diverged from the ancestors of true squids long before those tentacles became fixed features of the squid body plan, and what came through that divergence was an animal that never acquired them. Where a squid has 10 appendages, 8 arms, and 2 longer hunting tentacles, the vampire squid has 8 arms and 2 filaments that serve an entirely different purpose, structures that developed along their own evolutionary path and arrived at a form suited not to predation but to the passive harvest of falling matter. The absence of hunting tentacles is not a gap in the animal's equipment. It is a record of a road not taken, a different solution to the problem of persistence written into the body as a structural fact. Remotely operated vehicle observations of the vampire squid in its natural habitat have accumulated over decades of deep-sea research, and in all of that footage, across all of those hours of observation at depth, no predatory strike has ever been recorded. The animal does not lunge at passing organisms. It does not track the bioluminescent flashes of small crustaceans moving through the water column. When small animals drift near it, it does not respond with the rapid arm extension that characterizes octopus predation or the jet-propelled pursuit that defines squid behavior. It remains still, or moves slowly away, or simply continues whatever unhurried motion it was already engaged in. The stillness in the footage is not the stillness of an animal lying in ambush. It is the stillness of an animal that has no ambush to conduct, one that has, over an evolutionary span too long to hold comfortably in mind, arranged itself around a different way of acquiring what it needs. Arranged itself around a different way of acquiring what it needs. Arranged the detrital material the vampire squid eats descends through a water column that is itself undergoing continuous transformation. Near the surface, marine snow particles are relatively fresh, recently aggregated, still carrying the intact cellular structures of the organisms that compose them. As they sink, bacteria colonize them and begin breaking down the organic molecules within, extracting energy and releasing the byproducts of their own metabolism into the surrounding water. The particles become smaller and denser and chemically simpler as they descend, their bacterial communities cycling through generations over the days and weeks of the particles' fall. By the time they reach the depths where the vampire squid lives, they have passed through this transformation and arrived as something that is neither fresh nor spent, nutritionally concentrated in some respects, depleted in others, but consistent and continuous and always falling. The bacteria within the marine snow particles are themselves a significant component of what the vampire squid consumes. Bacterial biomass is protein-rich and energetically dense relative to the structural material of the particles surrounding it, and an animal capable of digesting it efficiently gains access to a nutritional resource that is embedded in the food rather than constituting the food in a simple visual sense. The vampire squid's gut content, when examined in the research conducted by Henk-Jan Hoving and Bruce Robeson and reported in 2012, showed not simply the presence of marine snow aggregates, but the presence of intact bacterial cells, phytoplankton remnants still carrying their lipid stores, and fecal pellets from zooplankton, a mixed assemblage of materials that reflects the full compositional complexity of marine snow and suggests that the animal's digestive system is equipped to extract value from all of it. The 2012 gut content analysis was significant, not merely for what it found, but for what it confirmed. Before that work, the vampire squid's diet had been difficult to study directly. The animal lives at depths that are expensive and technically demanding to reach, and it does not survive well under the conditions of a laboratory. Speculation had run along several lines. Some researchers had proposed that the filaments might be used to catch small living crustaceans. Others had suggested a mixed diet of living and non-living matter. The gut content analysis resolved these questions with the directness that only physical evidence can provide. The stomach contents were marine snow, predominantly and consistently, and the vampire squid was, uniquely among all known cephalopods, a detritivore. The word carries a weight that a simple description of the diet does not fully convey. Detritivory, feeding on dead and decaying organic matter, is a common and ecologically important feeding mode across many animal groups. Earthworms process dead plant material through soil. Sea cucumbers ingest sediment and extract organic matter from it. Many insects, crustaceans, and worms build their lives around the chemistry of decomposition. But among cephalopods, the class that includes the octopuses and squids and cuttlefish, animals that in nearly every studied species are active predators of living prey, detritivore had never been documented before. The vampire squid's diet is not simply unusual for a cephalopod. It is, as far as the available evidence shows, entirely without parallel among its closest relatives. This makes the animal something like a boundary marker in the ecology of the deep ocean. It occupies a position, phylogenetically a cephalopod, ecologically a detritivore, that no other animal occupies in quite the same way. It connects the living biology of the surface ocean to the deep ocean's recycling economy, drawing the products of surface photosynthesis downward through its body, processing them, and returning their molecular components to the deep water chemistry in altered form. Every feeding event is a transfer of material from one regime of the ocean to another, mediated by an animal whose body plan says one thing and whose ecology says something else entirely. The slow descent of marine snow through the water column above the vampire squid's depth has its own quality of time. A particle leaving the surface in productive open ocean water might take anywhere from several days to several weeks to reach 600 or 700 meters, depending on its size and density and the currents it encounters along the way. During that descent, it passes through the photic zone where light still penetrates, through the mesopelagic layer where faint traces of light persist, through the oxygen minimum zone where the water holds almost nothing for a respiratory system to work with, and eventually arrives in the cold, dark, or pressurized water where the vampire squid waits. The particle carries within it a kind of delayed record, a chemical and biological message from the surface world, encoded in its composition and arriving at depth with a lag measured in weeks. The vampire squid, eating this material, is consuming the surface ocean's recent past. There is something in this that the mind wants to sit with, even in the dark. The phytoplankton that composed part of a marine snow particle may have photosynthesized in sunlit water during a surface bloom that has long since ended, its population crashed, its cells dispersed and sinking. The bloom itself was a response to a seasonal upwelling of nutrients, which was driven by wind patterns at the surface, which were shaped by temperature gradients across thousands of miles of open ocean. The vampire squid, eating its accumulated filament of marine snow in cold and lightless water, is connected, through this long chain of physical and biological processes, to the wind that blew across the surface weeks before. Nothing in that chain requires a mind or a purpose. Each step follows from the one before it, physical necessity meeting biological necessity at every transition, the whole sequence proceeding with the same inevitability as water finding its level. The filament, retracted and then extended again into still water, receives what the water column delivers without preference or selection. A pellet of zooplankton feces adheres as readily as a fragment of diatom frustule. A mucus thread produced by a larvacean's feeding apparatus arrives alongside a clump of bacterial cells bound together by their own secretions. The vampire squid does not choose among these. Its digestive system handles the mixture, and what it can extract, it extracts, and what it cannot is passed through and released back into the water column as the animal's own waste, which will itself, in time, become part of the sinking organic matter that other animals at greater depth will encounter and process. This cycling is one of the deep ocean's fundamental economies, matter that enters the ocean's interior, whether as marine snow or as the bodies of animals that migrate downward and die, or as fecal material that sinks rapidly from mesopelagic grazers, circulates through a series of consumers and decomposers before its constituent molecules are finally returned to dissolved form, and eventually, over very long timescales, mixed back toward the surface by deep ocean circulation. The vampire squid participates in this cycle not as a passive element, but as an active one, an animal that consumes, transforms, and releases organic matter at a specific depth and in a specific chemical form, contributing to the deep ocean's internal economy in ways that ripple outward far beyond the individual animal's small and patient life. To think about the vampire squid eating is to think about an animal that has solved a very old problem in an almost entirely unexpected way. The problem is the one that every animal faces: how to acquire enough energy and matter to maintain the body, grow, reproduce, and persist. In the oxygen minimum zone, the standard solutions are unavailable. There is not enough oxygen for high speed pursuit. There are not enough living prey animals to support a predatory lifestyle in a community where the hypoxic water excludes most potential prey species. There is very little of anything by the standards of the productive ocean above. What there is in abundance relative to everything else is marine snow, the continuous, slow, nutritionally dilute rain of organic matter from the surface world, and an animal willing to reduce its needs far enough to live on it. The willingness is not willingness in any intentional sense. No animal chooses its metabolism or its feeding strategy in the moment. What happened across an evolutionary span that extends back before the divergence of modern squid and octopus lineages is that the animals whose metabolic rates were lower, whose energy requirements could be met by less, whose feeding structures were suited to passive collection rather than active pursuit, survived better in this environment than those whose bodies demanded more. The deep, oxygen depleted, food sparse water was and is a powerful filter. What passed through it and persisted was something like the vampire squid: soft, slow, patient, its filaments extended into still water, its metabolism burning at a rate that the deep ocean can sustain. A filament hangs in dark water at 700 meters. It is longer than the animal that produced it. Its surface carries the finest imaginable texture, projections too small to see without magnification, distributed along its length in a pattern that maximizes surface area available for particle contact. The mucus coating them is tacky and persistent, designed not for a single capture, but for continuous accumulation over an extended period. Around the filament, the water holds almost no dissolved oxygen, less than 1/4 of a milliliter per liter, a concentration so low that most organisms encountering it would begin to suffocate within minutes. The water temperature is near 4 degrees, cold enough to slow nearly every biological reaction in any organism not adapted to it. The pressure is equivalent to 70 times the weight of the atmosphere above the surface of the sea. In these conditions, the filament drifts. A particle of marine snow arrives from above and adheres. Another follows. Minutes later, the filament continues to drift. The animal at its base hovers with its fins moving slowly, drawing just enough water past its gills to maintain the exchange of what little oxygen the water contains. Its heart beats at a rate calibrated to this, neither faster nor slower than the demands of its current moment require. There is no hunting, no pursuit, no expenditure of energy toward anything that has not already arrived. The vampire squid exists here in a state that, described in those terms, sounds like waiting, but it is not waiting in any effortful sense. It is simply being in the way that an animal, whose biology fits its environment precisely and completely simply, is, without surplus motion or deficit, exactly what the place it lives in has, over an immense span of time, made possible. The surface ocean, miles above, continues to produce and die and sink, phytoplankton bloom, and crash in response to light and nutrients and temperature. Zooplankton graze and excrete, and are themselves consumed. The biological machinery of the sunlit water churns at the pace that sunlight and seasons drive, converting light energy into organic matter, cycling that matter through bodies and waste and death, sending a fraction of it downward with every passing day. The fraction is small. Most organic matter produced in the surface ocean is consumed and respired before it sinks far. But the ocean is large, and a small fraction of a very large number is still a quantity that, falling continuously through the water column and arriving at depth in the form of marine snow, constitutes a real and reliable food source for an animal that has arranged its entire biology around receiving it. The vampire squid has no mechanism for moving to find better feeding grounds. It does not migrate vertically in the way that some mesopelagic animals do, ascending at night to graze in more productive shallower water and descending at dawn to rest in the dark below. The oxygen minimum zone's upper boundary, where the oxygen concentration drops precipitously, functions as a ceiling that few animals from below could pass through and survive, and the vampire squid's physiology, while exquisitely suited to hypoxic water, does not appear to extend easily into the more physically demanding conditions of the zone above. It lives where it lives, within the oxygen minimum zone's cold interior, and the marine snow comes to it. This arrangement, the animal stationary, the food mobile, inverts the typical logic of predation so completely that it requires a reorientation of how feeding is understood. In the classic predator-prey relationship, the predator moves and the prey either moves or is stationary. In the vampire squid's ecology, neither the animal nor its food is moving in the directed sense. The animal hovers and the food drifts downward under gravity, and the encounter between them is the result of the food arriving at the depth where the animal has positioned itself. There is no chase, there is no trajectory to calculate, there is only depth and time and the slow delivery of what the surface world releases. Over very long time scales, the surface world's productivity varies. Ocean circulation shifts, upwelling patterns change, phytoplankton communities evolve and are replaced. The amount of marine snow reaching any given depth fluctuates across seasons, years, and the longer cycles of ocean climate. The vampire squid's slow metabolism, its minimal locomotion, and its passive feeding strategy together make it relatively resilient to short-term fluctuations in food availability. An animal that burns so little energy can afford to wait through periods when the rain of organic matter is sparse, sustaining itself on what it has accumulated and on the continuous if variable supply that the water column provides. This resilience to scarcity may be one of the deep reasons the lineage has persisted across geological time through ocean climate shifts and changes in productivity that would have extinguished animals with higher requirements. The connection between the vampire squid and the surface world is real and continuous, even if the animal itself never approaches that world. Every particle that adheres to an extended filament carries within it a fragment of sunlight, transformed by photosynthesis into carbon compounds, transformed again by bacterial decomposition into a denser and more complex mixture, and finally transferred through the animal's body into the deep water chemistry of the oxygen minimum zone. The vampire squid is one thread in a continuous exchange between the surface ocean's productive light-driven biology and the deep ocean's slow, cold, chemistry-driven recycling economy, a thread that has been in place for a very long time, conducting this quiet transfer in the dark, below the reach of light, at the edge of what any respiratory system can sustain. The filament is extended again. It is always being extended again. The water column above holds its cargo of sinking particles, each one the end of a chain of biological events that began at the surface and concluded here, in the dark, in the cold, against the sticky surface of a structure with no equivalent anywhere else in the cephalopod class. The particle adheres, another follows it. The filament drifts in water that holds almost no oxygen, under pressure that no human body could survive, in darkness that no human eye could use, and the animal at the other end of the filament, soft and dark and unhurried, its metabolism burning at the lowest rate its class has achieved, its heart steady in the cold, receives what the ocean offers, as it has for longer than there have been names for any of this, and continues. Where every other cephalopod lineage traveled toward speed and predation and the energetic gamble of pursuit, this one lineage moved in the opposite direction, slowly and without intention, generation by generation, until it arrived at a place so far from where it began that the distance is nearly impossible to measure in biological terms. Not smaller or weaker, simply different, in a way that the environment of the oxygen minimum zone has sustained and the surface ocean could not have produced. The departure from predatory feeding is not a diminishment. It is the record of a different kind of persistence, written in the body of an animal that is found in the cold and the dark and the thin dissolved chemistry of the deep ocean exactly enough. In the darkness at 700 meters, the vampire squid holds a dim, continuous light. It comes from across the whole surface of the animal, a low, even glow distributed along the mantle, tracing the edges of its arms, gathering at the fin bases in two soft, steady points. The color is blue-green, the color of deep-sea bioluminescence the world over, the color that seawater transmits farthest before absorbing it. No sunlight has reached this depth in any measurable quantity, no moonlight. The only photons in this water are the ones that living bodies make themselves, and here, in this cold and still and oxygen-thin place, the vampire squid makes them quietly, continuously, as a background state, the way a warm-blooded animal maintains its temperature, not as an event, but as a condition of being. The glow is not bright. Against the surrounding dark it is perceptible, but only just. Something within a few meters of the animal might register its presence. Beyond that, the light dissolves into the water, and the dark absorbs it completely. And for all the cold volume of ocean surrounding this one small creature, the total illumination it produces amounts to almost nothing at all. But almost nothing at 700 meters, where the baseline is 0, is sufficient. The photophores that produce this light are distributed across the animal's body in a precise and non-random way. There are organs along the mantle surface, organs at the base of the fins, organs along the arms, and a pair of particularly large focus structures at the posterior tip of the mantle, the caudal fin bases, that generate brighter, more directed spots of blue-green light under separate neural control. Each individual photophore is not simply a cell that glows. Within each one, a layer of light-producing tissue sits behind a reflective surface, and in front of that, a structure shaped and arranged to focus the output, something like a lens, small and precise. The whole organ is optically organized. What emerges from it is not scattered light leaking from a chemical reaction, but a controlled, directed, shaped output, a point source with intention built into its structure, even though the animal that carries it has no intention in any sense a waking mind would recognize. Only the deep, continuous operation of biology, doing what its lineage has refined over hundreds of millions of years. The large photophores at the fin bases glow now with a steady, focused quality, different from the ambient luminescence of the mantle. They are brighter, more directed, against the general dim glow of the surrounding body. They would stand out to any light-sensitive eye within range, two separated points of blue-green intensity against a softer background, a pattern with structure, with geometry, with spacing that is consistent across every adult of this species and has been for longer than most lineages of deep-sea fish have existed. What that pattern communicates, if it communicates anything at all in the cephalopod sense, if there are other vampire squids close enough and often enough to receive it, is not fully known. But the organs exist, and they are large, and they are controlled, and the animal uses them. The fact of their function precedes any complete account of their meaning. The mantle surface, holding its low glow, moves only slightly as the animal breathes, a slow periodic compression and expansion of the soft tissue, drawing oxygenated water across the gill surfaces in an exchange so metabolically modest that the motion is nearly invisible. The fins pulse once, a slow single wave, and the animal shifts a few centimeters in the dark water without apparent urgency, without apparent destination, settling again into stillness with the ease of something that has no reason to be anywhere else. A disturbance arrives, not a predator, not a sound exactly, but a change in the water's character, a shift in pressure, too subtle for most sensory systems to resolve, felt here through organs seated deep within the animal's body on either side of the brain. These are the statocysts, two fluid-filled chambers, each containing a small dense grain of calcium carbonate suspended in fluid and resting against a bed of hair-like sensory cells. The grain is called the statolith. When the animal moves, or when something in the surrounding water moves and sends a wave of displaced pressure outward, the statolith shifts fractionally within its chamber, pressing against different hair cells, bending them, generating a signal that travels to the nervous system and registers as information about direction and acceleration, about what has changed and where. This is the animal's sense of its own position in space, and it functions in complete darkness without reference to any visual input at all. The statolith does not know it is a statolith. The hair cells do not know they are hair cells, but the system they compose gives the vampire squid a precise and continuous awareness of its own orientation in featureless, lightless, structureless midwater, the weight of a grain of mineral doing the work that in other animals the horizon and the sun do. The disturbance passes. Whatever moved through the water at the edge of detection has gone, or was never large enough to matter. The statolith settles back to its resting position. The hair cells return to their baseline. And the vampire squid, which responded to none of this with any visible movement, which betrayed nothing of the sensory processing its body just conducted, drifts on in its low-glow stillness, the fin bases glowing steadily, the mantle surface lit from within by its quiet constellation of photophores, all of it continuing as before. There are animals in the deep ocean that produce bioluminescence as a startled response, a sudden bright flash to confuse a predator in the instant of an attack. There are animals that use it to lure prey toward their own mouths, a cold light at the end of a stalk, drawing smaller organisms into darkness that turns out to be teeth. There are fish that counter-illuminate their undersides with photophores matched to the faint downwelling light from above, erasing their own silhouettes against the slightly less dark water overhead. Bioluminescence in the deep sea is not rare. It is not a single strategy. It is a tool that evolution has arrived at independently in separate lineages dozens of times across the history of ocean life, and each arrival has bent the same basic photochemistry toward a different end. The vampire squid uses it in all of these modes, and in a way that is its own. The low resting glow may function as counter-illumination. The full-body activation, when it comes, is startling in its completeness. And the bioluminescent mucus, the sticky luminescent cloud ejected from the arm tips when the animal is sufficiently threatened, belongs to a third category entirely, a strategy for which there is almost no parallel in the rest of the cephalopod class. The mucus emerges from glands at the arm tips and expands slowly through the surrounding water as a diffuse, loosely bounded sphere of glowing material, each particle within it continuing to emit blue-green light for minutes after the animal has moved away. Unlike a dark ink cloud, which works by blinding and confusing through opacity, the mucus cloud works by drawing attention toward itself and away from the animal. A predator with light-sensitive eyes, approaching the vampire squid from below or from the side, would see the cloud expand suddenly and brightly, much brighter than the ambient glow of the animal itself. And in that moment of redirection, the vampire squid, moving quietly on slow fin strokes, would be elsewhere. The cloud persists. It continues to emit light long after the animal that made it has dissolved back into the dark water. Whatever is tracking the light finds the cloud, and the cloud is empty. But the cloud is also beautiful in the way that cold things seen in darkness sometimes are. It expands without urgency through water that holds no current strong enough to disturb it, the individual luminescent particles drifting apart from one another in a slow widening that looks, in the recordings made by remotely operated vehicles, like a small galaxy dispersing, blue-green light in a dark field, spreading, each point maintaining its glow, while the whole structure loses coherence, particle by particle, until the last one fades and the water is dark again, and the vampire squid is gone. The eyes of the vampire squid are proportionally very large. In an adult whose mantle is around 5 or 6 inches long, the eyes reach nearly an inch across, a ratio of eye to body that places this animal among the extreme end of the distribution across all animal life. The eyes are not compound like an insect's, offering a mosaic of low-resolution images. They are large, simple, camera-type eyes with a single wide lens capable of gathering whatever faint light the deep ocean offers, and photoreceptors tuned to blue-green wavelengths, the wavelengths produced by most deep-sea bioluminescence, the wavelengths that survive longest in seawater, the wavelengths in which the dark ocean, when it is lit at all, is lit. Color discrimination in these eyes is likely limited or absent. What the animal gains from this architecture is not the richness of a color-calibrated image, but an extreme sensitivity to faint light. A single photon striking the right photoreceptor in the right condition may be enough to register. At 700 meters, where the ambient light level from above is essentially unmeasurable, and where the only light in the water is produced by other organisms, this sensitivity matters. A bioluminescent flash from a distant organism, another squid, a fish, a small crustacean, caught at the edge of the visual field, can be detected and its direction inferred. The eyes do not need to resolve a sharp image of the source. They need only to register that something glowed, and approximately where. This is what vision in permanent darkness becomes. Not the construction of a scene, not the reading of color and texture and detail across a wide field, but the detection of rare brief events in a field of otherwise absolute black. The eye becomes a photon trap, optimized for sensitivity at the cost of everything else, keeping watch in a world where keeping watch means noticing a faint blue-green point of light for a fraction of a second before it disappears. The vampire squid's eyes are open now, and the water in front of them is uniformly dark. Nothing moves within the range that would produce a detectable signal. The mantle glows, The fin-based photophores glow steadily. The rest of the ocean holds nothing that generates light close enough to matter, and the eyes register nothing, and this is the normal condition. The eyes are not bored by this. They do not tire of the darkness, or long for a different kind of water, or wait for anything in the way that a waking mind waits. They are simply open, sensitive, doing the slow and patient work of detection in a place where detection is rarely necessary, and continuing when a full body activation occurs, when the vampire squid responds to a sufficiently close threat, with the whole photophore array firing at once, the change is total and fast. All of the ambient glow of the resting animal becomes in an instant a simultaneous flash from every light-producing organ on the mantle surface, the arms, the fin bases, the posterior tip. The animal goes from dim to fully lit in the time it takes the nervous system to conduct a signal from the brain to the periphery. This does not take long. The flash is brief, intense, blue-green, and complete. It covers the entire surface of the animal, so that for a fraction of a second, the vampire squid is the brightest thing in a very large volume of dark water. What this achieves depends on the animal encountering it. For a predator approaching from close range, with eyes adapted to the near dark, this sudden full-body flash is a form of dazzle, overwhelming the photoreceptors with a light intensity far greater than the background, temporarily reducing the predator's ability to resolve where the animal is, which direction it is moving, how large it is. In the moments of photoreceptor saturation, the vampire squid on its slow fin strokes may gain enough distance to be no longer worth pursuing. It does not need to move fast. It needs the predator to briefly stop. After the flash, the animal may produce a rolling wave of light instead of sustained full illumination, a bioluminescent pattern that begins at the arm tips and travels across the mantle toward the posterior in a slow, smooth sequence, one photophore array activating after another in a continuous moving band of blue-green light. This wave, in the recordings taken by deep-sea cameras, moves at a pace that seems almost leisurely, taking a full second or more to traverse the length of the animal. It has the quality of a tide pulling through shallow water. It has the quality of something turning over in slow water and catching the light. Seen from outside in absolute darkness, it is one of the more extraordinary things biology produces in the deep ocean, a small wave of cold light moving across a soft and ancient body, controlled, directed, purposeful in its physics if not in its psychology, and belonging entirely to this one animal on this one lineage, in this one zone of the ocean where the oxygen has almost run out. The vampire squid does not occupy this zone because no other choice was available. The arrangement is not a compromise. It is not an animal making the best of an impossible environment through sheer tolerance. The vampire squid's presence in the oxygen minimum zone is the outcome of deep evolutionary time, working on a lineage with specific biochemical and metabolic properties, shaping them toward a set of conditions that, however extreme from the outside, represent a functional and sustainable home. The hemocyanin binds oxygen at concentrations other cephalopods cannot extract. The metabolic rate runs at a level calibrated to what that oxygen binding can support. The gills provide the surface area needed to make the exchange work. The diet of sinking organic matter is available in this zone without requiring active pursuit. The bioluminescence operates in the absence of any ambient light, providing communication and defense through an internal energy source rather than an external one. All of these things fit together, not because the animal designed them to fit, it did not, but because the ones that did not fit did not persist, across an amount of time so long it is difficult to hold. The lineage that would become Vampiroteuthis infernalis diverged from the common ancestors of squids and octopuses before those two groups fully separated into the forms we know them by today. It has been refining this specific set of solutions to this specific set of conditions for something like 300 million years, moving through geological time while continents broke apart and oceans opened and closed, and the oxygen content of the sea rose and fell, and rose again. The animal now hovering in the oxygen depleted dark at 700 meters is not a primitive form, not a failed experiment that survived by accident. It is the present expression of one of the oldest continuous cephalopod lineages on Earth. 300 million years is a number that passes through the mind without landing, for the most part. It is easier felt as the accumulation of generations, uncountable, each one slightly different from the one before, each one passing to the next whatever configuration worked, whatever biochemistry held, whatever behavior proved successful in the cold and dark and oxygen-thin water. Every successful generation was the whole universe to itself. Every one of them lived out its brief existence in the same darkness, at the same depth, eating the same drifting particles, producing the same cold light, sensing the same rare disturbances through the same mineral grain and fluid against hair cells. None of them knew they were part of a lineage. None of them knew they had persisted. They simply were, each one in the dark and the cold, and then were not, and the next generation was, and the next, and this continued through the Triassic and the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, while the dinosaurs rose and fell above them, while the continents moved, while the asteroid came and everything on the sunlit surface of the planet reorganized, while mammals evolved and diversified, and one of them eventually developed the neural architecture to lower instruments into the deep ocean and find the vampire squid still there, still glowing, still making the same cold light in the same dark water. The animal found by those instruments does not look like a thing that has been in the ocean for 300 million years. It looks small. It is small. The mantle is roughly the length of a human hand, the soft tissue gelatinous and dark, the fins pulsing in a slow and barely perceptible rhythm that produces almost no displacement of the surrounding water. The eyes are large and still. The arm web hangs open in the cold water like a soft circular structure, its edges smooth, its surface uniformly dark against the even darker surrounding water. The retractile filaments trail behind the body, at lengths greater than the whole animal, their surfaces fine and still, collecting whatever the water column delivers. Nothing about this appearance communicates age, or persistence, or the weight of geological time. Nothing about it suggests that this soft and quiet animal is carrying within its single body the outcome of an evolutionary duration that exceeds the age of the earliest dinosaurs by 100 million years. It looks in the cameras of the remotely operated vehicles like something moving gently through water it has always known, which is exactly what it is. The full-body photophore array rests now in its low ambient mode, the glow distributed across the mantle surface in an even blue-green light that does not vary in intensity, does not pulse, does not change with the slight movement of the fins. The fin-based photophores glow in their steadier, brighter mode, two focused points against the dimmer background of the rest of the mantle. The surrounding water is dark and cold and holds no current strong enough to feel. The pressure at this depth is the equivalent of roughly 70 times the weight of the atmosphere at the surface, a number that means nothing as a number, but as a felt quality would be the complete compression of any gas-filled space in a surface-adapted body, every cavity collapsed, every bubble eliminated. The vampire squid carries no gas-filled swim bladder. Its tissues are soft, gelatinous, nearly neutrally buoyant at this depth, and the pressure does not crush them because there is nothing for the pressure to crush. The animal and the water it lives in are in this respect nearly the same thing. The cold holds steady near 4 degrees above freezing, not quite the coldest water in the ocean, but cold enough that chemical reactions slow, cold enough that metabolic processes require very little fuel to maintain, cold enough that the already low baseline metabolism of this animal becomes in absolute terms one of the most reduced metabolic rates of any macrofaunal animal in the deep sea. The animal burns so little energy per unit of time that its resting state is closer to a sustained suspension than to the active living of a warm water cephalopod. It is not unconscious, it is not dormant. Its nervous system is operating, its photophores are producing light, its eyes are open and functional, its statocysts are processing information. But all of this costs so little and draws on so little of the thin oxygen available in the surrounding water that the animal can sustain it indefinitely on the chemistry of the zone it calls home. The arm web drifts slightly as the animal makes one slow fin pulse. The web, the dark circular umbrella of connected tissue linking all 8 arms at their bases, hangs open in the cold water, its smooth circular edge barely disturbed by the fin movement. In stronger current, it would fold inward against the arms, wrapping the whole arm cluster into a tight, smooth package. Here, in the stillness of the oxygen minimum zone's core, it simply hangs, open and soft, its surface uniformly dark. Underneath the arm web, on the inner surface of the connecting tissue, small finger-like projections called cirri line the arms, each one a soft, flexible filament, shorter than the arm itself. These cirri, along with the web surface they sit on, give the inner umbrella a texture that is not smooth, a slight, irregular softness that may serve in handling and holding the mucus-bound food parcels the retractile filaments collect. The whole inner surface of the open web, seen from below in the cold water, would appear as a dark, slightly textured dome, not threatening, not striking, simply there, soft and slow and continuous. There is a pattern of behavior called the pineapple posture, named for the shape the animal assumes when fully expressing it. The arm web folded completely back over the mantle, the arms turned outward and upward, the inner cirri exposed to the surrounding water. The whole body transformed from a smooth, circular webbed shape into something spiky and irregular and very different in outline from the resting posture. This is not feeding behavior. It may function as deterrence, the sudden transformation from a small, soft, round-bodied animal into a larger, spiky, irregular form, accompanied in some observations by the activation of the large fin-based photophores and a partial full-body bioluminescent display. Whether a predator at this depth, encountering the vampire squid and then the pineapple posture, experiences anything that translates to deterrence in a behaviorally relevant way is not known with certainty, but the posture exists, and the animal uses it, and the transformation is striking enough that the researchers who first documented it named it for the shape it produced. The animal does not perform the pineapple posture now. It rests in its normal configuration, arm web open, fins at their slow pulse, the ambient glow distributed across the mantle surface. The water around it is as it has been, cold, dark, thin of oxygen, still. A particle of marine snow drifts through the small cone of blue-green light produced by the fin base photophores and passes out the other side without touching the animal, continuing its slow spiral toward the deeper water below. The vampire squid does not move to intercept it. The retractile filaments extended into the dark water at lengths greater than the body drift with the slight movement of the animal's position, and whatever the water column delivers to their sticky surfaces accumulates in silence. This is the arithmetic of survival at the oxygen minimum zone's core. Almost nothing in, almost nothing out, a balance so finely drawn that the margin between sustaining and not sustaining is measured in fractions of a milliliter of dissolved gas per liter of cold water. The vampire squid lives inside that margin. It has always lived inside that margin, or close enough to it, that the distinction blurs across the long span of its lineage's persistence. There was no single adaptation that made this possible. There was no moment when the lineage became deep-sea animals, or became bioluminescent, or became detritivores, or became low-metabolism creatures capable of surviving on oxygen that would incapacitate anything swimming above them. There were instead many thousands of small changes across an enormous span of time, each one tested against the conditions of the zone, each successful one persisting, the whole accumulation producing, in the present, this animal, soft, slow, glowing faintly, suspended in cold, dark water at a depth where almost nothing else can live. The deep ocean is mostly this quiet, not the silence of emptiness. Marine snow falls through it continuously. Bioluminescence flickers at irregular intervals in many places. Organisms of many kinds occupy the water column at different depths. But the scale is so vast, and the density of life so low, that the predominant quality of the deep sea is space and stillness, and the slow passage of organic matter from the sunlit surface world downward through hundreds of meters of cold and increasingly dark water into the zone where it becomes food or substrate or sediment on the floor. The vampire squid lives partway along this descent, in the zone where oxygen is thinnest, where the rate of organic decomposition by bacteria has consumed almost everything the surface world sent down, where the residents must be calibrated to slow and patient extraction of whatever resources remain. The blue-green glow of the mantle surface continues without variation. The fin-base photophores hold their steady brightness. The eyes are open. The statocysts work. The hemocyanin in the bloodstream binds its oxygen molecules from water that holds almost none, passing them to tissues calibrated to operate on what arrives. The retractile filaments drift. The cold presses in from every direction, and the pressure holds at its constant deep-sea weight, and the darkness beyond the small cone of bioluminescent light is absolute. There is no sunrise at this depth. There is no season that penetrates this far. The surface ocean above is currently in some particular hour, of some particular day, in some particular part of the year, but none of that arrives intact at 700 meters. What arrives is the slow, steady rain of organic material from whatever has recently lived and died above, and this is continuous and largely undifferentiated by time. The vampire squid does not track the passage of light cycles, or adjust its behavior to the seasons of the photic zone above. Its world has one sustained condition, and the animal is precisely built for it. Some cephalopods live for less than a year. Some squid, particularly in temperate and productive waters, complete their entire life cycles, growth, reproduction, death, in the span of 12 months, burning fast through their brief existence on a diet of abundant prey in well-oxygenated water. The vampire squid is thought to live considerably longer, years at minimum, perhaps many years. An animal with so low a metabolic rate, in so cold and stable an environment, on so continuously available a food source, has no reason to burn through its biology quickly. It grows slowly. It matures slowly. It reproduces in a way that reflects the low energy logic of its whole existence. The female broods her eggs, carrying them within her arms, for what is thought to be an extended period, the embryos developing at the slow pace appropriate to a cold, dark, oxygen-thin water column. None of this has been directly observed in full detail. The vampire squid does not breed easily in any setting a human observation could maintain. What is known comes from inference, from captured females found carrying eggs, from the general logic of deep sea life history applied to an animal whose metabolic rate and environmental conditions constrain the range of possible strategies. The animal carrying the eggs, like all adult vampire squids, maintains its low glow in the deep water. The eggs, if present, develop in cold and darkness without any input from the surface world, driven only by the slow biochemical processes that work at 4 degrees Celsius with the oxygen that careful binding of hemocyanin can extract. Each egg a potential lineage. Each embryo carrying forward the same solutions that have worked for 300 million years, prepared to be born into the same darkness, at the same depth, in the same oxygen-thin water, and to spend its life, when it comes, doing what every previous generation of this lineage has done, drifting, glowing softly, collecting what falls. The fin pulse comes again, slow, single, barely disturbing the water. The arm web sways fractionally and settles. The mantle surface glows.